Evolve or Perish. Chapter 17. Unemployment. Unemployment exists in the United States to an extent unparalleled in our history. The situation is an acute one, potent with all kinds of dire possibilities for social and economic disturbance. The present temporary spell of prosperity has not altered this situation. When the existing wave of prosperity, founded on the creation of synthetic purchasing power by vast government expenditures over several years, comes to an end, the unemployment problem will be more acute than it was in the midst of the Depression. It will be more difficult to handle than during the Depression because it will be accompanied by economic and social disturbances that may be beyond the power of the government to quell, and the cause of which they cannot eliminate because they have waited too long. This coming situation is written in the records of the past and the present. Unemployment did not develop suddenly during the Depression. It had been growing for a long time, disguised by various other factors. Our population had been increasing rapidly. In the early days of our national existence, life was lived on a simple scale. We were able to supply our simple needs through our comparatively inefficient methods of production. Our wants and our consumption of goods have increased at a much more rapid rate than our population. These increased demands have been met by increased productivity of our workers, aided by the increased use of power and labor-saving machinery. The labor displaced by machinery did not appear in the form of an unemployment problem, because for many decades the expanding West absorbed a large portion of the population. The West filled up, and about this time there came a more intensified and widespread use of labor-saving machinery. New industries were developed that absorbed some of the excess labor. Chemical and electrical industries expanded. The automobile was a newcomer. It brought a road-building program, development of the oil industry, increased use of steel, and the creation of a widespread servicing industry. The new industries were quickly placed on a mass production basis, with labor requirements reduced to a minimum. The new industries, however, were able to supply all of our needs that we were financially able to satisfy without absorbing all available labor. The increases in our population, with their constant increases of the supply of labor, were not being absorbed by industry. The newcomers were taken into industry. They were young, strong, active, and productive, and were given jobs. The older men were dropped to make places for them. The man over 40 was forced out. Many people will recall the acute problem of the years before the war concerning the man over 40 and his inability to get a job. We didn't have an unemployment problem. It was an individual problem with the middle-aged man. The composition of our population has been changing. The number of younger people is decreasing due to the decreasing birth rate. The number of older people is increasing due to the advances in medical science and improved sanitary conditions in our communities which permit people to live longer. The increasing number of older people has become an increasing burden on the decreasing number of younger people. The decrease in the number of younger people placed a relatively smaller burden on industry. There were fewer of them to be employed. The decrease in jobs was made less apparent by the decreasing number of applications for them. The number of persons employed on the farms, in business, in factories, and in the homes increased more rapidly than the population until the beginning of the century, but not more rapidly than our consumption of goods. The increasing productivity of our workers, increasing more rapidly than the rate of population increase, supplied our increasing wants and a surplus for export. The increasing use of power and machinery at the beginning of the century created an employment problem by 1910. It was becoming critical by 1914 when the World War broke out. This first created a great demand for goods that absorbed all available workers. And then a great many of the younger workers were taken for the army. Supplying the post-war demand for goods in the war-torn countries continued to furnish employment for our labor. A great amount of purchasing power was put in circulation that floated boom conditions. When this purchasing power was absorbed into the capital structure of corporations and individuals, and there impounded, the boom was continued by an elaborate program of credit extension financed by the impounded money in the capital structure. The net result of this program was to mortgage the future purchasing power of the workers to make available purchasing power to absorb the current production of goods, which should have been absorbed by adequate current wages. In addition, the workers were receiving only half-portion wages, the other half being continuously plowed into the capital structure. The half portion they did receive had to be used to purchase current production and satisfy credit extended to them. As a result, the purchasing power of our domestic market diminished to a critically low point due to the economic malnutrition of the workers. The crash was inevitable. What did business and industry do to cure this dangerous case of economic collapse? It increased and accentuated all the factors that produced the crash. It tried to cure a case of economic starvation by reducing its economic nourishment. The cure consisted specifically of reducing wages and salaries and discharging workers. The net result was an enormous reduction in payrolls, which are the economic nourishment of the nation. The nation, which collapsed from economic malnutrition in 1929, had its economic nourishment reduced steadily until in 1932 it was 40% of what was received in 1929. In 1933, the government took hold of the situation and threw billions of dollars of economic nourishment to the people, with resulting improvement of the condition of the nation. Business and industry, however, have continued their regime of economic starvation. Just as soon as the government ceases to throw billions of dollars into the economic circuit, the country will collapse again to the condition of 1932, and will then go to still lower levels. The situation in the United States was an exact parallel of the situations in other countries. All of the countries of Europe were facing exactly the same conditions produced by exactly the same causes. They tried to cure their troubles by exactly the same measures, accompanying them by individualized political decorations and, in some cases, upheavals. The situation is described in the World Economic Survey, published by the League of Nations in 1935. The prolonged and persistent unemployment of such large masses of workers is a new phenomenon in modern times, and one which has evoked grave and universal concern. It is a disconcerting fact that after almost 2 years of recovery in many countries, world unemployment was still more than twice as great as in 1929. It is evident that industrial recovery of the type and extent so far achieved has not been adequate to solve the unemployment problem. The economic outlook at the beginning of 1935 was distinctly more confused and unpromising than it had been a year earlier. The recovery thus registered has been well described as superficial rather than fundamental. Moreover, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the uneven rate of recovery was increasing the strain on a precariously maintained international equilibrium. In the United States, there are, in 1936, millions of unemployed. The number may be 10 million, or it may be 2 or 3 million less. Out of our total population of 125 million people, 50 million are nominally available to be gainfully employed. Our unemployed are 15 to 20% of the available workers. Normality has been achieved in October 1936. According to statisticians, yet the number of unemployed has been reduced to a comparatively slight extent. Authorities disagree in their figures on the extent to which unemployment grew during the Depression. The National Industrial Conference Board reported that in May 1935 there were 9,711,000 unemployed, and the National Research League estimated 14,090,000. The American Federation of Labor fixed the number of unemployed workers in February 1935 at 11 million and the number gainfully employed at 38,934,000, not including federal relief workers, and the number on relief at 22 million. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration reported 2,599,975 families on relief in February 1934, and that the number had jumped to 4,485,076 by February 1935. By September, 16% of the population was being supported by federal relief. In order to remedy this situation, President Roosevelt poured billions of dollars of borrowed federal government money into the economic circuit to prime the pump. Relief money was widely distributed and public works projects were started to give industry a boost so that it could get an immediate start to rise from its prostrate condition and get the unemployed workers back to their jobs. The flood of relief money was loosed early in 1933. In October 1935, President Roosevelt pointed out that since 1933, production had increased to 90% of the 1923 to 1925 average, but that employment was back to only 82% and payrolls to 74%, and added that he was asking industry the reason. Mr. Roosevelt made his recovery plan explicitly. He proposed to bring about recovery by laying down a foundation of purchasing power among the great mass of the population comprising the workers and their families, and to have this purchasing power maintained by industry taking on all of its discharged workers and financing the cost out of the business created by the federal expenditures on public works. When industry took advantage of this situation, it was morally, ethically, and even legally bound to accept the principle upon which the opportunity was predicated. Industry did not do this. Its attitude was, "How gullible Mr. Roosevelt is to think that prosperity starts from the bottom. We know that the only way to bring about prosperity is to make industry generously profitable at the top, and then let the benefits percolate down to the people." Industry tried its plan, and it was a miserable failure. General Hugh S. Johnson, former director of the National Recovery Administration and active in the Public Works Administration, summed the situation up nicely in his speech at the San Diego Fair, October 1935. He said, "The other reason is that our slow recovery of at least one-half the distance from complete collapse to normal business has shown very little reduction in the vast army of the unemployed. Authorities say there were 12 million people out of work in March 1933 when business was at 50% of normal. Now, business at the present is 77% of normal and more than halfway back, and there are 10 million jobless. Now, if 50% of complete recovery re-employs only 2 million people, 100% will re-employ 4 million, and that leaves 8 million without jobs. That just won't do." Subsequent developments have shown that General Johnson was right. Normality has been achieved, and we still have from 7 to 10 million unemployed. It is quite apparent that under our present way of handling problems, there is no alternative to supporting a huge army of completely unemployed and an equally large army of partially unemployed. Business recovery has failed to eliminate unemployment. When business started on the downgrade, unemployment was laid to technological developments, and it was proposed to declare a 10-year holiday for science. When this proposal was made, a meeting was held at the Museum of Science and Industry in New York, at which addresses were made by Dr. Carl T. Compton, president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Dr. Robert K. Millikan of the California Institute of Technology, and Dr. Frederick B. Jewett, director of the Bell Telephone Laboratories. Their conclusions were that science creates more jobs than it destroys, that it has contributed more economic blessings than handicaps, and that technological improvements are a positive factor in the advancement of civilization and the welfare of the human race. Their defense was not based entirely on facts. Their claim that scientific developments and technological improvements create more jobs than they destroy is not valid. If labor-saving machinery did not destroy more jobs than they created, there would be no market for them. It is common for completely automatic machinery to double or triple the output of goods formerly produced by a process, part machine and part manual. Let us consider a situation in which an automatic machine requiring 5 men to operate it performed all the services formerly supplied by 20 men. On the basis of the number of employees involved, 15 men were thrown out of employment in this plant. On the basis of production, 35 men were thrown out of employment. In order to double the output under the old system, 40 men would have been required, but the machine does it with 5 men. The wages of the 35 jobs destroyed on the basis of production or output, estimated at $32,500 a year, would have paid for the $100,000 machine in 3 years. Thereafter, the $32,500 a year is clear profit. The wages of the 15 men actually discharged would pay for this machine in 8 years. The argument is advanced that while labor is replaced by the machine, other labor is required to build the machine. This is true as far as it goes, but it leaves the important truth unstated. The important fact is that the labor required to produce the machine, from idea to finished product, is smaller in amount and cost than the labor which the machine replaces. Every hour of time and every bit of material that went into the planning and building of the machine is included in the selling price of the machine. Nothing is left out. There is included a big profit for the builders. And even at this selling price, the buyer of the machine saves money on the labor which it replaces. What is true of this particular machine is true of every machine. They all replace more labor than it takes to build them. Unemployment, therefore, is directly linked with the use of labor-saving machinery and technological improvements. It is not the fault of science or the machines that these technological improvements create unemployment. The fault lies in the manner in which the machines are used. The responsibility rests with our industrialists who have used the machine for the exclusive benefit of capital. All of the economic benefits went to the stockholders. The changes brought about by the machines could have been administered so that the benefits went to the workers. They were entitled to the major portion of the benefits. They not only did not receive any benefits, but suffered losses of jobs and wages with highly detrimental effects on the country as a whole. When a machine is installed, there rests upon the employers the responsibility to retain all employees and to reduce their hours of employment and increase their wages to the fullest extent possible. Every employer who discharged any workers because of the installation of improved machinery, or who with the same number of workers increased his output, is individually responsible for his share of the unemployment situation and of the depression. Every time output was increased without a proportionate increase in purchasing power of the community in the form of increased wages in that particular factory, a portion of unemployment and depression was created. Unemployment is due to a very simple economic mechanism, and this is entirely under the control of those who are directing the operations of the individual units of industry. Unemployment is caused by lack of purchasing power. Lack of purchasing power is due to inadequate wages. Lack of adequate wages is due to failure to employ the full number of available workers and/or failure to pay the workers just and adequate compensation. The cycle through which the economic circuit operates is a simple one. Industry is supported by the purchasing power of the country in which it operates. This purchasing power is maintained by wages paid by industry. Each element in the economic cycle is a limiting factor on the following element. The extent to which industry can function is limited by the purchasing power available to absorb its output. The extent of purchasing power available is limited by the wages paid to the workers who maintain the industrial machine. The wages which industry can pay is limited by the amount which industry receives of the available purchasing power. Figure 56. If industry cuts its payrolls 50%, buying power is reduced by half, and industry is able to participate in the economic circuit operations to only 50% of its former capacity. This is the capacity which it set for itself by payroll reduction. One complete revolution of the economic cycle brings industry back to the same relative position it was in before the payroll cut was made, and it is faced with the necessity for a further cut, and so on through many revolutions of the cycle until collapse takes place. Industry does not feel the effects of its payroll reductions immediately. The purchasing power that is moving around the circuit, figure 56, maintains a degree of prosperity above the level that would exist if the payroll reduction were immediately effective as reduced purchasing power. Industry speeds up production by those workers remaining on the payroll. It aims at and approaches normal output, which is gained at much lower costs due to the reduced payroll. Hence, profits are greater during periods of decreasing employment. Even when the cycle tightens up so that the profits are not greater in absolute magnitudes, they are relatively greater on the reduced output basis. The unemployed, those who formerly supported themselves out of wages earned in industry and which were part of industry's costs, are now supported out of government funds. These funds fill or partly fill the void created by the reduced payrolls. These public funds flow into industry's income, thus preventing it from feeling the effects, or at any rate not the full effects, of the unemployment which it created. Figure 57. On the contrary, industry operates on a far more profitable basis than was possible when the full number of workers were employed. This is the reason we have great prosperity evidenced by corporations while the country is in the midst of a depression and widespread unemployment. This situation must eventually lead to a far greater crisis than we experienced in the Depression. Our big banks are alarmed over the unemployment situation and its associated evils, but they have thus far failed to grasp the significance of unemployment as a symptom of a deeper economic disorder, and, naturally, seem to have no idea of what the cure should be. They talk of such superficial matters as the need for freedom for business to earn profits, unbalanced production, and inequitable price regulations. The Guarantee Trust Company, New York, in its monthly survey of business, May 1935, stated, "Unemployment is crucial from every point of view, social, political, and financial. It is the greatest cause of human suffering and degradation. It is the most dangerous breeder of social and political unrest, and it is the most prolific source of budget deficits, crushing tax burdens and monetary disorders. The only escape from the dilemma is through private business recovery. This is the sole alternative to the financial disorder and moral disintegration that lie in the direction of long-continued unemployment relief. It follows that the greatest task of government and business at present is to cooperate in every possible way in helping private industry and trade to put men back to work. The principal steps necessary is to allow business enterprise to proceed in normal manner with a minimum of restrictions on its freedom of action and on its prospects of reasonable profits. The National City Bank New York also sees the dangers inherent in unemployment. It states in its bulletin, "There is ample evidence of a disrupted economic organization in the unemployment and in the huge government expenditures carried on to make up for purchasing power which is lost through unbalanced production and inequitable price regulation." The bank almost stumbled on a nugget of truth. If it had said that the huge government expenditures were carried on to make up for the excessive dropping of workers and the slashing of payrolls by industry, it would have hit the nail on the head, but instead it indulges in the meaningless statement that the purchasing power is lost through unbalanced production and inequitable price regulation. The statement continues. Of course, accumulated demands for goods become effective only when purchasing power exists, and unless there is an equitable balance among costs and prices of the various goods and services, and among other complex relations within the economic system, trade is blocked and purchasing power is lacking. If instead of studying complex factors, our bank economists would give a little thought to the simple and fundamental factors affecting the economic circuit, as described in connection with figures 56 and 57, they would very quickly get to the roots of our problem. The type of wisdom that is peddled under the guise of economics is partly responsible for the totally illogical and wholly unscientific viewpoints that are being held by responsible individuals in our economic structure. Here is a sample paragraph from the writings of a well-known business economist. In view of this condition, it seems reasonable to say that in order to increase employment and payrolls in line with production, the wage rate must be lowered and the share the work plan must be discontinued. In other words, the price of labor must be allowed to seek its natural level relative to the price paid for other factors of production. This individual recommends that in order to increase employment and payrolls, work must be concentrated in fewer employees and they must be paid lower wages. This individual would have said with less insult to one's intelligence that the way to go upstairs is to fall downstairs, and the way to dry a piece of cloth is to plunge it into water. Is it any wonder that we have such a topsy-turvy economic system, and that the interpretative statements from leading banking institutions consist largely of meaningless conglomerations of words? If we are willing to courageously seek and face the facts, we will have no trouble in locating the definite sources of our economic troubles. The condition which we call a depression is merely the integration of a vast number of specific cases of simple economic dishonesty. This applies to every industry in the country. We will take a particular industry and observe the conditions existing in it. We will study the tobacco products industry, which supplies us with our cigarettes, cigars, and pipe tobacco. Here are some statistics assembled from the records of the Department of Commerce and the Department of Agriculture concerning this industry. The story these figures tell is presented graphically in Figure 59. It is a highly significant story they tell. Note that the amount of tobacco used by the industry increased steadily up to 1930, with the exception of slight dips in 1920 and 1921. This curve also describes the sales income of the industry because the prices remained practically stationary up to 1930. During the period in which the sales increased 20%, the payrolls and employment decreased 30%. The tobacco industry took for itself in 1930 20% more of the purchasing power of the country than it did in 1919, and it reduced by 30% its contribution to this purchasing power. The farmers who supplied this industry with its tobacco leaf were treated in exactly the same way as the industry treated its employees. The prices the farmers received for their crops were forced down just as were the payrolls. There were wide swings up and down in the tobacco prices, but the trend was the same as for the payrolls, and the net result was worse. By 1930, the farmers' prices for tobacco were reduced by 45%. During this period of prosperity, the tobacco industry increased its sales and its income from sales 20%, and reduced its payrolls 30% and its prices to farmers for its raw material 45%. This is the way the tobacco products industry handled its affairs during prosperity. Let us see what it did during the Depression. The first year of the Depression was 1930. In 1929, the tobacco industry sales were at 123, and in 1930 dropped to 120, or 96% of the previous figure. Employment stood at 73 in 1929 and at 69 in 1930, or 93.5% of the previous year. Payrolls stood at 76 in 1929 and at 67 in 1930, or 88.5% of the 1929 figure. Here is what these figures mean. A 4% decrease in business caused the industry to discharge 6.5% of its employees and to cut the wages of the remainder so that the payrolls were reduced 11.5%. The price the farmers received for their tobacco was cut 30%. There was utterly no justification for any of these reductions, but the worst is yet to come. In the second year of the Depression, the tobacco business dropped 7% and 7% of the employees were dropped. Not satisfied with this reduction, the industry slashed the salaries of the employees who were retained until the payrolls were reduced 16.5%. This is an act of economic piracy. There was no financial situation within the industry that required the corporations to take this action. This is demonstrated by the fact that the industry in this year paid its stockholders $107 million in cash dividends. Total wages paid were $69,411,000. The stockholders received $37 million more in dividends than the workers received in wages. And this happened in a year in which there was a 7% decrease in business, and the payrolls were cut 16.5%. In the third year, business dropped 7.5% and 11% of the employees were dropped, and payrolls were slashed 21%. During the first 3 years of the Depression, 1930 to 1932 inclusive, the business of the tobacco products industry decreased 14%. The number of employees was decreased 23%, payrolls were reduced 42%, and the prices paid to farmers decreased 44%. Payrolls decreased 3 times as much as the decrease in business, symbol unadulterated economic robbery. The unjustified slashing of payrolls in the tobacco products industry since 1919 has deprived the workers in the industry and the economic circuit of the country of not less than $250 million in purchasing power. And if the $350 million by which the prices paid to farmers were slashed is added, we have a total of $600 million withheld from the economic circuit. This amount of money, if distributed to the workers and the farmers instead of being plowed in the capital structure of the corporations, would have purchased 1 million automobiles or built 100,000 fine homes. The stockholders of these corporations did not increase their automobile purchases by this amount or build additional homes for themselves to this amount. The money went into banks to await investment outlets and join other idle money similarly tied up. There was not the faintest shadow of an excuse for any of these wage cuts. The industry was on a very profitable basis in 1919 and could have maintained itself at this level through the succeeding years without cutting the payrolls a single penny. It could have continued to pay the farmers the 1919 prices for their tobacco, in addition to maintaining wages and employees at the 1919 level, and have continued on a highly profitable basis. Had wages and farm tobacco prices been maintained, the workers and farmers would have been able to enjoy prosperity. Instead, the industry impoverished both workers and farmers while it was enjoying a magnificent prosperity. This is the mechanism by which prosperity breeds depressions, by which a parasitic capitalistic structure bleeds an economic circuit and destroys its own foundation. What the tobacco products industry did with its gross income can be ascertained from data compiled by the Census of Manufacture of the Department of Commerce and from corporation income tax reports. The figures tell an interesting story of how the leaders of this industry handled its affairs and how they benefited at the expense of the workers, the farmers, and the country as a whole. The graphical presentation of these figures, figure 62, shows clearly the extremely small portion of total income which goes to wages and the equally small portion that goes to the tobacco growers. It is interesting to note that the fraction of total income which went to these two items in 1921 was cut in half by 1931. It is also interesting to note that the dividends showed a substantial increase during this period. All costs were forced down during this decade, and all benefits went to capital, to the stockholders. The line which shows the total cost of wages, tobacco, materials, supplies, fuel, and power, all the factors that enter into production, shows a decrease from 70% of total income in 1921 to 37% of the total income of 1931. Production costs were cut in half. The tobacco products industry is one that is being continuously more highly mechanized, substituting machines and electric power for workers. In 1923, it used 43,515 horsepower. By 1927, it has risen to 52,385, and by 1929 to 64,984. The productivity index rose from 100 in 1919 to 117 in 1923, to 137 in 1926, and 163 in 1929. The data on all of these factors have been given index numbers with 1921 data equal to 100. They have been recalculated for each year on the basis of the total value of products for each year equals 100. This gives the true relative values of these factors. Figure 63. As the horsepower used increased, an index of the increasing use of machinery, employment decreased. As productivity increased, the payrolls decreased. As the values added by manufacture increased, the average wage decreased. As a result of this all-around robbery of the workers, the net income of the corporation increased by 50%, and this makes no allowance for the parts of the gross income that were diverted into the capital structure, plowed in. The situation could have been transformed into one providing increased wages for the workers, no reduction in the number of workers but reduced working hours for them. Instead, the workers were robbed for the benefit of the stockholders. The amount and kind of social consciousness possessed by the leaders of this industry is indicated by the way in which they treated their workers and the stockholders. In 1921, the wage earners received a total of $120,903,000. And the stockholders received $79 million. By 1929, this situation was reversed. The wage earners then received $94,579,000, and the stockholders received $128 million. The income of the stockholders per wage earner was $533 in 1921, in which year the average wage earner received $810 per year. In 1929, the income of the stockholders per wage earner was $1,110, when the wage earners again received $810 per year. The stockholders received $300 more per year per wage earner as profits than the workers received as wages, and this situation in 1929 was followed in the 3 succeeding years by the corporations slashing payrolls to 3 times the extent to which business declined. This situation in the tobacco products industry is somewhat more acute than the situation in other industries, but the difference is only in degree. The same processes that have been in operation here have been in operation in all other industries. The situation is typical, and it gives a clear-cut picture of why prosperity brings depressions. It shows how unemployment is willfully, ruthlessly, and unnecessarily created by boards of directors acting for stockholders. It shows how the welfare of the entire nation is imperiled to enrich a handful of avaricious capitalists who refuse to let the people of the nation as a whole receive any economic benefits from the advances of science and technology. The cause of unemployment has been made very evident, and the responsibility for it is clearly placed. Once the nature of a problem is determined and the causes producing the trouble ascertained, the cure becomes a matter of action. It would be well to hark back to the discussions of the unemployment situation by leading banks and economists quoted earlier in the chapter, and note how they have completely failed to state the nature of the problem due either to willfulness or ignorance. The solution of the problem is a simple one, but it involves the halting of widespread economic piracy. The pirates are extremely influential among those who have the responsibility for halting such piracy through legislative action. Legislative action would be ever so much better than direct action from other quarters. The viewpoint that will lead to a solution of the unemployment problem must recognize the following facts. Employment is the mechanism by which the individual participates in the production of wealth and the distribution of wealth by the nation. It has a wider significance than merely being on a payroll. Every individual is under responsibility to the nation to participate in the production of what the nation requires. Through employment and production, the individual discharges a responsibility to the nation, and through wages, the nation discharges a commensurate responsibility to the worker. Production of goods is a function of society, and not a matter of individual choice. The employer, whether individual or corporation, is under the same status and carries the same responsibilities to society as the individual. The individual is utterly without rights to decide that he will not participate in the production activities of the community. The employer is utterly without rights to decide that he will not extend employment facilities to his proportionate share of the available workers. No employer has a right to dissociate from production activities any worker competent to continue in such activity. Adjustment to changing conditions is a matter for decision by proper community authorities and not by an individual employer. All economic thinking and planning must be based on the primary fact that wages are the only source of purchasing power, and that the purchasing power of the community is the source of income which industry transforms into wages. That any reduction in any factor restricts the whole economic cycle. That every participant in any department of production is engaged in a community or national activity, and that national or community interests are coextensive with individual interests in every enterprise.